Today down in the comments, I want to know, what is your favorite Joe Bob Briggs moment, your favorite Joe Bob Briggs memory, something about Joe Bob that gives you the warm and fuzzies. We're only talking about his newer show, The Last Drive-In, on this episode, but I want to hear Monster Vision and earlier and stuff about your personal connection to everyone's favorite horror host. Hello, I'm Adam Caesar. This is Project Black T-shirt, and today I am not wearing a black T-shirt. No, I am a Yankee wearing a dime store Texas shirt, as you can see here. I don't even know if this is Texas. This is someone with a lot of casino points T-shirt. And I'm wearing that because today we are talking about Texas's favorite son, Joe Bob Briggs, and more specifically his show on Shudder called The Last Drive-In. And make sure if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, go check out my other videos where I've always got at least one movie recommendation and at least one book recommendation per episode for you. And at the end of this episode, we're going to be talking about not one, not two, but 3 different Joe Bob Briggs related books. For those of you who haven't been keeping up, Shudder did this 8 or 9 movie all-day marathon where Joe Bob Briggs, for one last time, hosted a number of features. But it was so successful that they had him back for a Thanksgiving show, then they had him back for a Christmas show. Then they greenlit a season of The Last Drive-In, and the first season's just ended. And it's been greenlit for a second season, so we're going to talk about, so far, what are the 5 best episodes of Joe Bob's The Last Drive-In on Shudder. Now, I didn't say the 5 best movies on Joe Bob's Last Drive-In, because I'm not going to talk about what I think are the best movies. I'm going to talk about the movies that I think these 5 movies have made the best experience of sitting down, opening a beer or 2 or 3, and watching Joe Bob Briggs masterfully discuss horror cinema, drive-in cinema, exploitation cinema, and these are the 5 movies that I think will give you the best idea, especially if you haven't watched any of The Last Drive-In on Shudder. And if you don't have Shudder, there's a link down in the description with my code, ADAM. If you sign up with that, it'll get you a free 30 days. My first pick is the very first movie shown during the very first marathon. It is Tourist Trap. Now, Joe Bob's assessment of Tourist Trap is emblematic of why I think he is such an interesting film personality, film critic. I don't think he likes being called a film critic, but who knows? He does all this stuff in character. There is no Joe Bob. There's just John Bloom. And Joe Bob is a character he plays, and the line blurs between them. But as dollars for donuts, I think he's one of the best film critics out there, if not the best. And I think his assessment of Tourist Trap, a film that might get written off as schlocky, might get written off as a drive-in programmer, the way he talks about the style of the film, the way he talks about the introduction of absurdism into rural horror, Texas Chainsaw ripoff to a certain extent, makes this really, really stand out, this episode. His appreciation of the school of absurdism that director David Schmoller brings into Tourist Trap, and the way that he connects dots that I had no idea about. I've always liked Tourist Trap, I've always liked the movie, but I had no idea that the director studied under Alejandro Jodorowsky. I didn't know any of the things about star Chuck Connors that Joe Bob brings up, and it's a really good episode, and it's a really good idea. It really gives you an idea of Joe Bob's style if you're not familiar with him, because he'll go off on these tangents, and he'll go off on these tangents specifically in this episode about Chuck Connors and Chuck Connors' sports career and all these different things, and it gives you this kind of version of Joe Bob as almost like a tall tale storyteller, where he knows incredible levels of minutia about a wide variety of subjects, and about specifically redneck subjects, as he will tell you, but in such a way that for half of the episode of Tourist Trap, I was just like, is this true? Does Chuck Connors really do this? And most of it checks out. Most of this stuff is not apocryphal. This is all real stuff. It's not a bit that Joe Bob is doing. It is this genuine interest and knowledge base that he's drawing from. Tourist Trap is a movie that really benefits from watching it with Joe Bob, even though I think it's a great movie on its own. All right, the second film we're going to talk about is something that Joe Bob started doing in the season 1 of The Last Drive-In. Is he started looking at more recent films. He started movies that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the drive-in experience, because when they came out, they didn't play drive-ins. When they came out, drive-ins, they're going, gone. They're almost an anachronism in American society and American culture. But they're movies that kind of keep that drive-in DNA going, and I like the idea, even if I haven't been a huge fan of some of the episodes that have newer films in them. It just feels like sometimes the episodes feel a little bit like he's stretching to talk about certain things. But the episode for Ty West's House of the Devil is one of the best episodes of the series, I think. This is a very recent movie, or what I want to call a very recent movie, but I didn't realize they've seen it, like, that it came out like over 10 years ago. So to me, in my brain, I'm just like, oh, this is a newer movie. It's not that new. It's a movie set in the 1980s during the Satanic Panic. Tom Noonan plays a creepy guy. Sorority girls hired to house sit or babysit a house, and it is a movie that has a retro, quote-unquote, throwback vibe to it, but is done in such a modern way and done in such an interesting way that I think I and a lot of other horror fans really were like, oh, Ty West, this guy's the guy to watch. This episode has one of the best opening monologues of all of the last drive-in, because it's a real showcase for another piece of obscure knowledge that Joe Bob Briggs constantly seems to bring into his presentations, which is religious knowledge. I have no real religion. I am not a religious guy. I don't know a lot about religion, but to listen to him talk about, as growing up Baptist, and his interest in like Catholicism and all these different things, to hear him talk about the devil as represented on screen, the devil and hell as represented on screen, is one of the high watermark moments of the whole series. If you've been skipping, like, oh, I don't know, I've seen House of the Devil pretty recently, I don't know that I want to watch it again, watch it with Joe Bob. But House of the Devil is a movie that I hadn't seen since it came out in 2009. It's a movie that I really liked when I saw it then, but it's been a decade, so it's a fun movie to watch with new eyes. It's a fun movie to watch knowing what Ty West has gone on to do, knowing what Greta Gerwig has gone on to do. Number 3 on this list is definitely not the best film Joe Bob Briggs has ever talked about, but it is one of the better episodes, especially one of the better early episodes of the last drive-in. This appeared during the initial marathon, Sorority Babes in the SLIMEBALL BOWL-O-RAMA. This is a mouthful of a title. This is a David Dakota film, ultra cheapy from the 80s, and Joe Bob's kind of curmudgeonly disinterest in the 80s as something that kids today love to fetishize, something that kids today love to enjoy, movies from the 80s. They think the best stuff happened in the 80s, and he is a strong disbeliever in that. But he really does give Sorority Babes in the SLIMEBALL BOWL-O-RAMA its due, maybe more than it deserves. This is such a fun episode, and it's one where you see Joe Bob's affection for Scream Queens. This film starred Robin Rochelle, Brinke Stevens, and Linnea Quigley. He sees some of these people when he goes to cons, when he signs at cons. You see this kind of real affection he has for this style of acting, for these women who have been in so many horror films, been in so many different other films, and maybe don't get the credit that they deserve, quite literally, because he talks about how Robin Rochelle is like weirdly credited under her real name on IMDb, and like he says you wouldn't do that with John Wayne, and it's an interesting back and forth with Scream Queenism, and this is just a fun movie. I think Sorority Babes in the SLIMEBALL BOWL-O-RAMA, as far as movies that are like tongue-in-cheek, or movies that are produced to be a little schlocky, movies that have a jive-talking imp puppet menacing co-eds. As far as films like that go, this was exactly the right era for that. 1988 was kind of the last gasp of being able to do this tongue-in-cheek, leaning into schlock in a way that was both fun and didn't seem cloying and didn't seem overly pandering. David Dakota, one of the most prolific directors in B horror film history, you get a little bit more information about him, and Joe Bob clearly has affection for him, and it's a neat little time capsule episode. I really like this one. 4th film on the list, and one I feel like I might get a little bit of flack for, maybe the only one I might get a little bit of pushback for, is a film that clearly, since I can pull it off the shelf, I am a fan of. This is Blood Harvest, the rural clown slasher starring Tiny Tim and directed by Bill Rebane. Now, this is one of the very best, if not the best, episodes of The Last Drive-In, because it is not only a testament to Tiny Tim, and Joe Bob brings in Tiny Tim experts, and he talks about Tiny Tim's weirdo career as both a pop culture icon and as a singer, and then this one lonely film as an actor. But you also get Joe Bob watching Joe Bob. You get a segment that Joe Bob originally did on USA Network, I believe. You watch the clip and you watch him talk about bringing Blood Harvest to cable television, and then you get home movies of Tiny Tim, older, surrounded by his kind of entourage, and they're filming him watching Joe Bob talk about the movie in the 90s. And it's a really kind of sweet moment. It's like probably the coolest moment outside of just the monologues and Joe Bob's jokes and Joe Bob's information of the whole series. So this is a movie that I try not to pay too much attention to it, but when these episodes go up, they're all live streaming, and it's meant to be like a cool communal experience. And it is really among my friends. We got to get home for Joe Bob, even though you can just watch it later in the collected versions. The initial stream is like a nice communal experience. But sometimes on Twitter, when I'm sitting there on Twitter, I see a lot of let's joke on this movie, let's Mystery Science 3000 this, and Blood Harvest was a movie that received a lot of that, and it's a movie that I had initially watched without Joe Bob. I had watched on the Blu-ray, and it's a movie I came late to, so it's not a movie that I have like crazy nostalgia for or anything. As far as like regional slashers go, it's really downbeat. It's got a great atmosphere. Tiny Tim's performance is super weird and creepy and tragic, and it's got just a lot going for it. It's a better movie than like I feel like sometimes the communal element of let's get on Twitter and talk about this stuff. If it's something you haven't seen before or something you don't have undue reverence for, people start just immediately not giving it a chance and shutting down. So I would urge you, go back, watch Blood Harvest if you haven't yet. But watch Blood Harvest with Joe Bob because it's a really interesting experience. And it's not only a reflection on the performer in the film, but it's almost a reflection on Joe Bob as he's been doing this for decades. He's been talking movies for decades, and him seeing his own influence on film history and film criticism and film preservation is a really heartwarming episode. It's like a very special episode of Joe Bob's Last Drive-In. And finally, my number one pick, my favorite pick, the best episode of Joe Bob Briggs' The Last Drive-In is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I almost don't need to talk about why it's the best. This is Joe Bob Briggs' favorite movie. This is a movie that he's done countless talks on, written countless papers on, all these different things. So it's his scholarship and his interest in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre makes this easily, I don't have the numbers. It's got to be the longest episode, but it's got the longest introduction. It's got the most interesting anecdotes. Even if you've read something like Gunnar Hansen's book about Texas Chainsaw, about filming Texas Chainsaw, you will learn something new about Texas Chainsaw because it is just he drills so deep and he talks so lovingly about this film. You can see that it's his favorite film, and the information that he gives you, even if you've seen the movie a million times, like I'm sure we all have. This is such an interesting way to watch the film. For this week's book recommendation, there are some real obvious ones I want to mention. That is Joe Bob Goes to the Drive-In and Joe Bob Goes Back to the Drive-In. Now, these books are out of print. I'm not sure why, especially because Joe Bob's kind of back in the lexicon. He's back in the spotlight. But these predate any on-air Joe Bob action. These predate any of his shows. The first one is a collection of reviews, a collection of articles, columns that he was doing for the Dallas Times-Herald. It has a Stephen King introduction. And the second one has a Wayne Newton introduction. But they are just so funny, so smart, so good. You can see Joe Bob's style kind of evolve throughout them. They're not always just about movies, and they're not always true. They've got this weird... he's just doing a bit. He's creating a character. He's creating girlfriends for the character. He's creating incidences that happen at the drive-in while he's describing the movies he saw over the weekend. They are great pieces of film writing. They're great, very off-kilter pieces of film writing, and I really recommend them if you can track down a copy. But our third book recommendation isn't print. This is Evidence of Love by John Bloom and Jim Atkinson. And this is a true crime book, and this is a true crime book written, in part, co-written by Joe Bob Briggs himself, John Bloom. This is about a crime in north of Dallas, Texas, in the early 1980s or 1980. Neighbor kills neighbor, and then like all the weird fallout in this Texas town from that. But it is incredibly well written, incredibly well researched. I don't read a ton of true crime. I usually stick to reading fiction, but this is a true crime book that almost reads like fiction, and the voice is so good, and it's not quite Joe Bob Briggsian because it's much more serious than that. But it kind of gives you a whole new respect for John Bloom as a writer. and as a researcher. What I'm in awe of about the Joe Bob Briggs character anyway. So Evidence of Love, that's in print. That's ebook, audiobook, paperback. That one's around. Joe Bob Goes to Drive-In. Joe Bob Goes Back to the Drive-In. If you catch Joe Bob at a convention, I think he usually has copies of them. He will sign them for you. My copies are signed. All right, that's that. I'm Adam Caesar. If you want to find out more about me or my books, you can join my mailing list. I'll send you a free couple short stories and a novel sample. Kindle, audiobook, paperback, they're all available. They're all ready for your consumption. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone who's picked up a copy of one of my novels. That's it. It's been a long episode. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week.